What are some of the biggest mistakes property buyers make when entering a contract here in Queensland? Well, today we are joined by Chris Burling from Business Depot Legal, and he's going to guide us through the contract process here in Queensland.
Welcome to the Brisbane Property Podcast with your hosts Melinda and Scott Jennison.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Brisbane Property Podcast, and we've got a special guest today. We've got Chris Burling from Business Depot. Welcome Chris.
Thanks for having me.
And just so that people understand, Chris is actually a solicitor. So we are going to go through a lot of common buyer mistakes that are made in relation to residential and commercial contracts here in Queensland. I think one of the things that a lot of people don't understand is that real estate has local state-based legislation. So the contract process is actually different regardless of, or depending on which state you're purchasing property in. So we're going to take a deep dive into Queensland and specifically some examples that Chris is going to share with us about buyers that have made big mistakes and where clauses in some contracts are there to protect buyers and or sellers and which clauses can be relied upon at different times.
And before we get into all the serious business, just so everyone does know, Chris is actually on this episode, and it's episode number 250 for us. So that's a special one for us. So welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, episode 250. I can't believe that you and I have sat here talking to each other that frequently. And, I'm really excited that Chris is part of this episode because, we've worked with Chris for many years and probably on our very first episode, we already knew Chris. So it's great that you're a part of this point in history.
It took a while to get you on here to share some of your knowledge, right? So thanks for coming on. Let's jump into some mistakes that people make. So common mistakes buyers make in the contract process. What are some of the most common mistakes buyers make when entering into a contract in Queensland?
Yeah, so there's obviously plenty of mistakes. Obviously people don't get advice before they're signing contracts and the flow on from that. So the biggest one we see is in relation to the purchasing or the buyer entity. Mm-hmm. So that could be as simple as individuals missing middle names from the contract or more complex, self-managed super fund purchases where they've either put the self-managed super fund on the contract instead of the bare trust if there's lending, or even things like having the structure set up incorrectly or not having the trust deed dated before the contract date.
And of course, if that happens, Chris, and we see it all the time, which is why we verify our client's identity up front to make sure we've got their full legal name, because if you're relying on clients just to pop their own name onto contracts, quite often they will miss their middle name, or they might have, a hyphenated surname and they casually drop part of that out. But what are the consequences if you get it wrong on a contract here in Queensland?
Yeah, so even like to that comment, I suppose, we've had accountants from other states and in Queensland give us entities that are incorrect, or in an incorrect way to describe it on the contract. And the issues are pretty serious because in Queensland, as distinct from other states, the transfer duty arises when you sign the contract, not when you settle. So if you have essentially entered into the contract with the wrong entity, or you attempt to use the or nominee in the contract, that is actually a potential second dutiable event. So the QRO can levy duty on the transaction twice if it's not handled correctly.
And of course, this is has huge impacts for a buyer that just doesn't understand. And it's one of the reasons why buyer's agents can mitigate this risk for their clients in ensuring that that purchase entity is correct. Now, potentially there's ways around it, but from my understanding, only if a seller agrees to play nice. Can you just explain, what strategies are in place there?
So essentially the first step would be to see if the seller is willing to rescind and enter into a new contract correcting that deficiency. But the seller is definitely under no obligation to agree, and you potentially risk losing the deal over it because the seller may have other offers. They may have received a better offer in the meantime, and then this can sort of unsettle them. They might think you're playing games or being difficult, and they may just say, this is too hard. We'll terminate or rescind and I'll take another offer.
Yep.
And of course, no one wants that when you've got to the point where you've been able to secure the asset that you're looking to buy, whether that's a home, investment, commercial property, and then, running into this sort of complexity at that time is really frustrating. And I'm sure it's frustrating for you as well. It creates a hell of a lot more work for you as a solicitor trying to work with the other side. But there's a simple way to rectify this, and that is make sure you know the entity you're purchasing in upfront and get it right on the contract.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely more time and money, but ultimately we want the best outcome for the client. And if there's a risk that they'll lose the property or pay extra stamp duty or whatever it is, that's certainly not what we want.
Chris, just for our listeners, if someone enters a contract and then they turn around and say, look, we've got our name wrong, or I forgot my middle name, or whatever it is, they ask to rescind the contract and they've already paid a deposit, and the seller says, no, we're not going to accept it, can they get the deposit back, or do they lose their deposit? Is that a risk as well?
Absolutely. Just depends whether there's any contract conditions or whether they've still got their cooling off period to potentially rely on. But yeah, there is a risk that they'll lose the deposit for sure.
Yep.
And I think one of the problems with buying real estate here in Queensland is that a lot of interstate buyers or buyers from overseas, they just don't understand the legislation here. What are some of the differences in purchasing here in Queensland compared to other states?
Yeah, so definitely one of the biggest things is the obligations on sellers to disclose. So I think we'll touch on that probably a bit later.
Yes, we will.
But other than that, I think insurance is a big one. So risk of the property in Queensland passes the business day after you sign the contract.
Yep.
So that always takes buyers by surprise. And it's always something to consider, if you're buying a tenanted property or you've got a long settlement, or say, for example, you're buying in an area that may be subject to severe weather events, you may want to change the contract so that risk actually stays with the seller. So if you'd entered into a contract a couple of months ago for a property in Townsville.
With the flooding.
Yeah, you'd potentially, and there's any damage to the property, you may end up relying on your own insurance. And if the buyer hasn't taken it out, then you definitely put yourself at risk.
Absolutely. And in relation to tenancies, we've talked previously on this podcast about the fact that the selling agent now it has an obligation to disclose if a property has been previously tenanted in the last 12 months and what that rent was for the previous tenancy agreement. Now, it doesn't always happen, and we've experienced this ourselves in-house that, sometimes that information is not disclosed. What happens if the buyer hasn't been provided with this information in that instance?
So in the scenario where no information's been provided at all? So that is obviously a difficult one, and it's a problem that comes up not just in relation to tenancies, but it might be something that's been given, like misleading information, or during the sales process. You've gone to the property and you want to buy it, but you only want to buy it if you can put a pool out the back. And of course, the seller's agent think that's a great idea.
Sure.
The seller was going to do it. They just didn't have time. They're moving to Europe, whatever it is. But I guess the key is sort of that communication, making sure you know what the priority is. You told your buyer's agent, you told your lawyer, this is why I'm buying it. I'm buying it as an investment. I want to rent it out. And if that's been communicated and we sort of haven't got the information, then there's definitely potential recourse against the seller after the fact. If the contract contains information about the tenancy and the last date that the rent was increased, then it is on the buyer solicitor to verify that by getting a copy of the notice of the rental increase.
Okay.
And then your rights to sort of cease that settlement.
Super interesting, and I think it's just highlights some of the discrepancies between legislation in different states. And I know we have a lot of clients that are quite confused about that process, especially if they're based in New South Wales and Victoria. There are seller obligations to require or to disclose certain information prior to entering into a contract. But even the contract itself usually is prepared after a period of exchange by the solicitors. Whereas here in Queensland, quite often the selling agent is presenting a contract directly to the buyer. And unless the buyer's had an opportunity to send that contract independently to their solicitor to review initially, sometimes I would say they'd sign without getting that advice because the market's moving so quickly as well. And that can actually put buyers in an enormous amount of risk as well. Would you agree?
Yeah, for sure. So obviously the condition of the market makes a big impact on that, because when things are fast or there's multiple offers, buyers do feel pressured to submit offers without having it reviewed. And they're also more than willing to sort of concede on negotiations, get rid of conditions. So sometimes we'll get contracts that have no conditions, like they're completely unconditional, big deposits. And then by then it can be too late potentially. So
what are some of the real life examples that you've seen in terms of mistakes buyers have made?
So I guess back to touch on the purchasing entity, buyer entity thing we've sort of covered. That is something that we see a lot. We had a client once come to us and engage us to assist with a commercial purchase and settlement. So they had been using another lawyer. So it wasn't necessarily all of the client's fault. But when we start an engagement, we'll verify the idea of our clients, we'll check the entity, make sure it's right and aligns with what's in the contract, make sure whoever we're speaking to has authority to give us instructions. And in this case, we reviewed the trust deed straight away. And the first thing we noticed was that it was actually dated after the contract date.
Wow.
Which is a huge, huge issue.
Yes.
The client probably wasn't aware of the facts. The first lawyer didn't pick it up. So this was a commercial purchase price over $3 million. Wow. So potential liability or additional liability of about $180,000 in duty, plus penalties and interest if QRO impose them. So basically, like once we picked that up, it was just about finding a solution and making sure that the buyer wasn't exposed to that.
Yeah, it's really interesting. That would put you at an enormous amount of risk. No one wants to be exposed to a liability of $180,000, that's for sure. But obviously that was with a big commercial purchase. Similar things can happen to first-time buyers, property investors, if they don't understand that contract process and they're putting forward offers without having their details correctly verified up front. So word of warning to buyers out there, just make sure you understand that process here in Queensland. You're purchasing in the right entity and you know that entity has been set up before you sign the contract.
In a market, we've got like the conditions at the moment, Chris, there's people obviously offering a larger amount of money, or they're starting to drop out conditions because that makes it more competitive, which we are seeing quite a lot of this as well. How important do you think it is for buyers to really understand that the finance, the building and pest, whether it's body corporate conditions, all of those types of things, how important is it for people to understand those conditions on a contract?
Yeah, so I think back to the seller disclosure obligations being minimal here. So the onus is on buyers in Queensland to do their own investigation, satisfy themselves. So it's absolutely critical that those conditions are, well, if they're in the contract, that the buyer understands how they work, their intricacies, and how they can rely on them. So I guess an example that I can think back to, we once had a client in Brisbane that was selling a unit. It was an older complex, so an older unit, but it was in relatively good condition. So they accepted an offer to sell to a buyer who only required a building and pest condition. They paid a very large deposit. I think it was 10% when they signed the contract, which we would usually advise against from a buyer's perspective. But that's what they did. And then a week later, we get an email from the buyer's conveyancer that the buyer wasn't satisfied with the building and pest report and they wanted to terminate the contract, which does happen. So the first thing we did on behalf of our seller was we wrote to them and said, okay, can we have a copy of the building and pest report? So the buyer's required to do that under the conditions. They sent the report back straight away, so no issues on their end in doing that. I opened the report and straight away knew there was something wrong with it. We see enough. I'm sure you guys see enough.
See a lot of reports. Yeah? That's right. Yes.
See them every day. So you know when something's off. So have a look at the inspector. There's a QBCC license number, so that all seems in order. I just put that through the QBCC license search and noticed that they're a low-rise builder. So they're not actually licensed to carry out completed residential inspections. So that seems like a long, boring story, but essentially the standard conditions of the REOQ contract say that a building and pest inspector, the report has to be prepared by someone who is licensed to do that. So the fact that this was an unlicensed report and it was relied on to terminate the contract was essentially the buyer relying on the conditions incorrectly and terminating without cause. So the end result was our client wanted to sell the property still.
Yep.
So we disputed the termination, and basically the options for the buyer either accept that they were about to lose a 10% deposit.
Wow.
Or buy a property that they clearly didn't want to buy. Yeah.
Wow. Huge risk for a buyer. And again, another reason why when choosing a building and pest inspector, make sure as a buyer that you know that you're working with a licensed operator, because if there is an issue with the property, from what you're saying, you cannot rely on that report to withdraw from the contract under that building and pest clause if you've used an unlicensed operator or your brother or uncle who's a builder. Yeah. It's not going to be a reliable report that you can rely upon under that contract clause.
I think just touching on that, some people I think do think that, oh, I've got a building and pest, and if I don't like something, I'll just pull out and I'll just terminate the contract. There have to be grounds to terminate, and they have to be serious grounds, obviously, without going into too much detail. But as you said, for a license search, and anyone can do this at all, if this is in Queensland, obviously, and you can literally just type in QBCC license search. You can put in the name or the license number, and it'll tell you exactly, and you can look at the history, you can look at all the information's there. Yeah. It's all available for anyone to actually do that. I am a licensed builder, but I'm not a licensed building inspector either.
Correct.
So I can't do that, and I can't do a report that would actually stand up either.
No, and to touch on the points about like the report needing to show something. So that was the purpose of asking for the report, and the reason that under the contract, the buyer has to provide a copy if requested, because it's to assess, well, is there reasonable objective grounds for a buyer to not be satisfied? And in that case, we didn't even get that far because they had already acted.
Yeah. Chris, can we move on? I'd love to talk about buyers that decide to do it yourself. And we don't hear about this often, but we do actually sometimes hear situations where buyers choose to represent themselves in that contract process without getting proper legal guidance. Have you seen instances where buyers have tried to do it themselves without a solicitor and later regretted it?
Like definitely more so a few years ago. Like it was very common, and it was it's very, very painful to deal with. Because you're doing it on your side, but then you're educating the other party on what they should be doing as well. I'd say the bigger issue, because since PEXA has been mandated in Queensland, most people are just engaging.
And just to help people understand PEXA, can you just describe what that is?
Yeah, so it's just an electronic e-conveyancing platform that financial settlements in PEXA happen. So financial settlement occurs at the same time as lodgement of the docs at titles.
Got it. That's great, so that people understand that.
I was really going to say that it used to happen a lot where people would basically do their own conveyancing, but I haven't seen it for a while now, so hopefully it's finished.
Well, I think the bigger issue now is people that would have probably done it for themselves previously will go and find the cheapest conveyancer they can find at these like ridiculously low rates, and then they get halfway through the process and something comes up, and then the conveyancer will say, well, that's out of scope, we don't do things like that, and then you're palmed off on somebody else.
And I think that obviously can take you down a path where you're not represented, and if you are purchasing and you're facing up against a solicitor who's representing the seller, who obviously is a lot more knowledgeable about the issues that might arise, it really is going to result in a lack of professional representation and guidance there. One of the things that we often see and hear is buyers entering a contract without really understanding what they're signing. Part of the reason for that here in Brisbane is because a lot of selling agents will present the contract to the buyer. It might be on a weekend. They might not have access to have that contract reviewed by a legal professional, but there's urgency that is created because there's other buyers lining up behind them. What are some of the risks to buyers of signing that contract there and then without understanding what it is they're signing and getting some legal I guess, review done prior?
Yeah. So I guess I'd break it up into two main areas. So there's the financial side.
Yeah.
And that could be that you get the purchasing entity wrong. There's the double duty that we discuss. But also potentially, you might sign an unconditional contract and for some reason your finance doesn't come through or whatever it is, and then you end up inadvertently in default of the contract. So straight away, depending on the type of default and what's happened, but your deposit's at risk. So you could lose that. And then in addition, the seller could terminate and potentially sue you for damages.
Right.
So the breadth of damages is very broad. It could be, their legal costs, real estate agent costs to sell again. And if they sell the property again for a lesser amount, actually the difference between the two contracts
is your liability.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, which is not great either.
I'll probably answer this question at the end, but I'm starting to get a bit of a trend on this conversation that you need to do work before you actually sign a contract. And everything we're talking about, and I've taken a few notes that we've gone through, everything we're talking about is getting your entity right, getting the advice, getting the contract reviewed. Everything is done prior to actually signing a contract.
Yeah.
And we see so many people that just rush in and go, oh yeah, look, I've got a contract here. Can you do this for me? Can you do the conveyancing? As opposed to getting that advice up front, ticking all those boxes and make sure everything's organised, getting the advice. I mean, you would have seen so many contracts, I presume, that they would delete a clause out and someone would not even pick that up, that a certain clause has been deleted out of a contract.
Or what that means.
And what it actually means to them.
Yeah, well, that's... I think we actually have worked on matters before where you get contracts and, the agent's done some bush lawyering and deleted out a heap of standard conditions, and all of a sudden the seller warranting that they'll own the property at settlement has been removed. And then obviously that was in a very tight market.
Which
is why it was happening. But it's just a huge risk. You either negotiate it or accept it, and some of those risks just aren't worth accepting.
It's so true. And I know that anytime we see standard conditions deleted by a selling agent or a seller's solicitor, we're always seeking guidance for buyers so that we can understand what that risk imposes, because we don't want to expose our clients to risk. Once a contract's entered into, Chris, here in Queensland, there's certain dates that there's key contract dates and timelines that need to be adhered to. What happens if a buyer misses a deadline, for example, by 24 hours? Is there any recourse? What could happen in that scenario?
Yeah, so this is something that there's a lot of misconceptions around. So if we're talking about a building and pest or a finance date, buyers seem to think that like a seller owes them a grace period. So if we get to 4 p.m. on the due date and we send through a request, we want an extension or we want some money off the purchase price for building and pest works or whatever it is, the seller isn't obliged to respond. So they can wait till 5 o'clock. At 5:01, they are entitled to terminate. That's it. So that expectation of a response is, I guess, incorrect in that sense. There's no obligation on a seller to do that. Then when we're talking about due dates for deposits and settlement, that is a whole other thing.
Okay.
They're essential. They're essential terms of the contract. And because time is of the essence, if you fail to pay the deposit on time or fail to settle on time, the seller can actually terminate, keep your deposit, and then sue you for damages.
So it is critical that you understand those clauses and timeframes in a contract. And of course, as buyer's agents, we are always guiding our clients and helping them understand those critical dates. But if you're working directly with your conveyancer or solicitor, please don't assume that there's a grace period. As Chris has identified, these are essential contract terms and you need to adhere to these to ensure that there's no ability for the seller to actually, I guess, cancel that contract.
Yeah.
Seller disclosure. This is something we've probably talked about quite a lot. Queensland is introducing new seller disclosure obligations. Can you just help us explain what that means?
Yeah. So the last few years, there have been proposed amendments to the Property Law Act. The intent was to simplify some old provisions, but also introduce some new concepts. So previously there was no seller disclosure framework. That's definitely been the biggest change and will be probably one of the the most difficult to implement in terms of the industry, because it is such a change from the current position. So I would say it's definitely a shift to a more buyer-friendly position, but not without its problems or its shortfall.
And so when is this legislation coming into effect?
So it was proclaimed at the end of last year, and will commence from the 1st of August 2025.
So for any buyers that are buying residential properties from the 1st of August this year, they can expect to receive a document from the seller that will disclose certain information about the property. What sort of information is likely to be included on that document?
Yes, so there's two arms to the disclosure. So there is a prescribed document which has been released, so you can see what that looks like now. And then the second is a list of documents that a seller has to provide. So the information that you can expect to see on the disclosure statement is just sellers' names, property details, address, details of unregistered encumbrances, which are already required to be disclosed in the contract, the zoning of the lots, whether it's on the Contaminated Land Register or the Environmental Management Register. So there is already an obligation to disclose that under the Environmental Protection Act, whether it's affected by the Heritage Act and whether it's affected by a notice of intention to resume, for example, from Transport and Main Roads. And then the amount of rates and water charges on the property. Okay. So that's sort of a summary. There's obviously other information. And then in terms of the documents that are required to be provided, so usually you will get a title search with a contract now, but it isn't actually required. So that will be mandated by the legislation. Seller will need to give a copy of the survey plan, which is good. They'll need to give a QBCC warning notice if there's been unlicensed building work carried out. Details of any show cause or enforcement notices issued for the property. And then any EPA notice, so same Contaminated Land Register, Environmental Management Register.
So it's a big step forward from where we are right now, because obviously if you're a buyer in the market right now in Queensland, sellers don't need to give any of that information to you from the 1st of August. It's likely to be mandated. The biggest, I guess, hurdle will be how is that all going to be implemented, and how a real estate sales agent's going to adopt all of these new things. And I know that Real Estate Institute of Queensland are running roadshows to educate the industry on what the requirements will be and how these things will be rolled out. But obviously anyone that's partnered with a buyer's agent up till now should get all of this information anyway before they're entering into a contract. There's obviously, in my opinion, additional disclosure or additional due diligence that should still be completed over and above what this compulsory seller disclosure will involve, but obviously that's not the scope of what we're discussing today. I think it's a really good step forward because we've had nothing. It brings us more in line with other states, but don't think that this is the only information that you should be relying upon in terms of due diligence before you enter a contract.
Absolutely, and to that point, it is great that we're moving in the right direction, but it's still probably not far enough. Like in my mind, it definitely doesn't go far enough, because that disclosure statement is given to you and you can potentially terminate if it's not given to you or if it is materially incorrect. But that right ceases at settlement.
So if you don't know that it's incorrect until after you've purchased, it means nothing anyway.
So the idea that this was going to sort of share the cost between buyer and seller for information is incorrect, because if we have a buyer come to us, it won't change our process at all. We'll still do the same searches. We'll still look at the property, look at the risks. Has there been recent additions to the property or improvements on the land? Should we do that sort of search, regardless of whether they've said no, there isn't? Because if we do the search and says yes, there is, that allows us to terminate.
Right.
But if we accept what the seller said and settle, then the buyer doesn't have any rights.
It's quite actually incredible that that's the way it is set up, because at the end of the day, buyers then still need to do a lot of work. I guess the benefit is that that can be done in the contract phase with protection to be able to withdraw if it is later found to be inaccurate information, whereas right now, traditionally, a lot of that is done upfront and not necessarily protected by clauses under the contract unless you're putting extra due diligence clauses in place. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And it's essentially the same as the body corporate position.
Yeah.
So under the BCCMA, which is the Body Corporate Community Management Act, seller has to provide a disclosure statement with bare minimum disclosure obligations.
Yeah.
But if a buyer relies on that and doesn't do their own investigation, like a body corporate record search, which is something that you guys do on every single purchase, and then you settle, that your rights subsist at settlement, so you have no recourse.
So important to know what you don't know and what needs to be done. And I think that's part of the problem. A lot of buyers actually just don't know what searches should be done, what due diligence needs to be done up front, and that's what ultimately exposes them to risk. But partnering with the right professionals to get that advice up front, or part of that contract process, is going to reduce that risk that a buyer might be exposed to. But also, let's not forget representation of sellers. And from what you've described, there's also, a lot of benefit for a seller to partner with a quality solicitor or conveyancer that's going to really look after their interests in that transaction as well.
Some advice for some buyers. What do you think? What are some good steps buyers should take before signing a contract to ensure they don't run into trouble?
Well, obviously, you want a really good buyer's agent.
Well, thank you.
Couple, yeah.
Couple.
Yeah. I mean, one too. So just get your professionals around you, like get your team ready as early as possible. So your buyer's agent, your lawyer, if you're looking at doing some development, you want a town planner, a surveyor potentially. Get that all sorted as early as possible, because that will be critical in your sort of search phase. And then there are other things, like I know we've discussed previously, like title insurance.
Yep.
So it's something that's very big in other states. And I've sort of seen an insurgence at the moment in Queensland where that's sort of, there's a push for buyers to take that out. It can definitely has its use and there's value there. But obviously you need to be very wary of what the policy says, if there's any exclusions, and what you're actually being covered for. But if you're forced into a multi-offer situation where you don't have protection of conditions and you're willing to accept that risk, that is one way to offset some of that.
I'm going to go there, even though you don't know the question I'm about to ask, Chris. But I think this is really critical, especially for buyers who may be partnering with solicitors and conveyancers that are trying to protect their interests in a competitive market like Brisbane has been for a number of years. When you're working with a solicitor or a conveyancer that is trying to protect the rights of their buyer, but they're making their offers commercially unviable, how do you balance protecting for the buyer against ensuring that buyer has the ability to be competitive in the current market? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it's really important that, any buyer, whether you're buying a business or a property or whatever it is to sort of be commercially sensible.
Yeah.
Because you're entering a commercial transaction where there's going to be risk, and the contract is the tool that essentially apportions the risk between you and the seller. So no seller is going to say, all right, I'll take on all the risk. No. You come into this transaction with zero risk, and no one's going to be happy with that. So I guess from our perspective as a lawyer or conveyancer or whatever your role is, we're probably not giving so much advice on the commercial aspect. That's where a buyer needs to engage a buyer's agent or speak to agents in the industry and get an awareness of what is commercially reasonable in the circumstances. But also, if you're not willing to do that and you're continually losing out on properties, probably have a think about what conditions you're putting in, whether they're reasonable. And I'd imagine you would get that feedback from sellers and sellers agents.
Absolutely. And just to help listeners understand what I mean by that is if you're working with a solicitor who is suggesting you must be working with a 21-day due diligence clause, which is going to be a get out of jail free card for you with any offers that you're putting forward, and you're wondering why you're not securing your home or the investment that you're looking to secure, it may be because your terms, that is that due diligence clause of a long 3-week period, is just not commercially competitive when it's sitting next to other offers that won't have that same condition. We always talk about making sure that your offer is competitive based on other offers in the market. And a lot of buyers right now are working on 7-day finance or building and pest terms. So if you've got due diligence terms or longer terms for protecting your interests, it's important that, potentially if you partner with a buyer's agent, a lot of that due diligence can be done up front to eliminate your risk before you enter a contract. Whereas if you're doing it alone and you're relying on that due diligence to all be done post-contract, sometimes that longer due diligence time frame can actually make your offers less competitive, which means you may not secure the asset that you're looking to buy in the first place. So it is a balance between protecting risk, because we're all for advocating against protecting clients, but it's also about being commercially viable as well.
Chris, final bit of advice for buyers. What can you help people when they're entering a contract in Brisbane in the current market?
Yeah.
Can you give just a final piece of advice, what to look out for or what to be aware of?
I think, and I'm sure I've covered this already, but I do think it just comes back down to getting advice from the right people.
Yep.
And it's probably to say that not all professional advisors, whether they're accountants, lawyers, buyers agents, they're not all equal. Make sure you know what you're looking to do and choose the right people based on that.
Yep.
Good advice, and couldn't agree with you more. And it's something that we often talk about on this podcast. So thank you for sharing that information, Chris. Now, of course, throughout this episode, people will be having their aha moment going, Chris knows his stuff. I want him to represent me when I'm buying my property or when I'm selling my property. If people want to reach out to you, Chris, how can they get in touch?
Yep. So I am at Business Depot Legal. So we have an office on James Street, and you can find all the details at businessdepot.com.au /legal. And yeah, that's probably the best way to get in
definitely
touch.
Be in the show notes.
We'll put the details in the show notes so that people can get in touch as well.
Perfect.
If people do need advice and need help, I can highly recommend Chris and Business Depot, because the work that you guys do for our clients is second to none, and definitely peace of mind when buying property, because it's a massive thing to do and you don't want to make a mistake. So get that advice up front. Mate, thank you for joining us.
No
Episode
worries.
250.
Yeah, I'll be here for 500 as well.
I hope so. We'll lock you in. We might have some new contract laws in place by then, and perhaps seller disclosure will have moved, because that's going to be another 3 or 4 years away based on how long it's taken us to get to episode 250. But look, we really appreciate you coming on today to share those insights. I know buying property is such, or the contract process associated with buying property is such a critical part of the process, and getting it wrong can cost people a lot of money. So we really appreciate the insights you've been able to share today, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you, guys.
Excellent. Well, hopefully that's been a lot of information for everyone there, and everyone's learnt a lot. Be aware and be organised, and make sure you are prepared if you're looking to buy a property. As usual, I'll let Melinda wrap it up. Until next week, take care and bye for now.
Thank you once again for joining us on this episode of the Brisbane Property Podcast, episode number 250. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share with friends and family. We would love for you to hit that subscribe button or leave us a review. It really helps other people to find this content. As always, we hope you have a fabulous week, and we look forward to speaking with you again soon. Bye for now.